All right, so good evening, everybody. My name is Michiel Bouwman, and next to me is my friend Nathan Buijsen. And we are from the Veritas-forum, or the Veritas-forum, for the English listeners. This is a Christian organization which is aimed at helping students who wrestle with the big questions of life. So what we do is we organize debates and interviews such as this one. And tonight we have with us Professor John C. Lennox, joining in from Oxford, is that right?
Yes, I'm very near Oxford, and that's my college, Green Templeton College in the background.
Right. So for those who don't know Professor Lennox, you are a mathematician and a philosopher of science, but also into Christian philosophy. And you used to teach at Oxford, at the Green Templeton College, in these fields. And well, you've been lecturing throughout Europe, but also Russia, as I understood, North America, and you've written a lot of books on mathematics, but also apologetics, and I think more on the latter than the former. Is that right?
I think that's fair to say, yes.
So to name a few, you've written God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? God and Stephen Hawking, A Response to the Grand Design, Gunning for God on the New Atheism, and then one of your most recent books, Can Science Explain Everything?, which has been translated in Dutch by Kok Boekencentrum, which is not a very international name, I would say, but it's Kan de wetenschap alles verklaren. We won't ask you to pronounce that.
Kan de wetenschap alles verklaren.
All right.
It's more German-like, I think.
Yeah, but it's a pretty good job.
I speak German, you see, so I can have a go.
All right. No, so this is why we're having this interview with you tonight, because we were asked by Kok Boekencentrum to ask you about this book, your motivations, what's in it. So that's what we will do for the next 45 minutes. And we're very happy to have the honor to conduct this interview. And before we dive into the book, I was just wondering, we just discussed this with you, but we always watch your debates. You have these debates on YouTube. For those who don't know, please go and watch, because it's very inspiring. But we are always wondering, how do you stay so calm and relaxed? Because your opponents are quite mean sometimes and quite challenging, and you stay so calm.
I'm glad you noticed that. I think actually it's very important. The way I stay calm is, first of all, I'm not particularly trying to beat them in an argument. I want to argue against their position. But long ago, I was given very good advice about interviews, and the advice was this: whatever your opponent says, make sure you make clear what you yourself believe. So that's point number one. Point number two, if someone with whom I'm debating or discussing gets angry or gets mean, as you say, then it seems to me that in the eyes of the audience, they've lost the plot. It's a very foolish thing to do from the point of view of a discussion. And what I try to do is to win people more than arguments, and be friendly, because I discover in the New Testament that Christ and his apostles were very friendly. That didn't mean they couldn't be sharp in counter-argument or fail to say what they believed to be true because they were afraid. And I think the third point in all of that is, I know that if I encounter an argument I haven't met before, I could just honestly say, I don't know, I haven't thought of that before, but I'm prepared to think about it. So in that sense, the last impression I want to give is that Christians are people that think they know everything. I don't know everything. I meet new arguments every week. So really, what I'm attempting to do is to put into the public space a credible position that opposes, that is, if I'm dealing with atheism or naturalism, that opposes the Richard Dawkins or Peter Atkins of this world.
I hope our listeners took notes of your debating skills so they could practice themselves. So let's move on to the book. So we both read your book about if science can explain everything. And we both thought that it was really well written. It's very clear and easily understandable, also for people who are not familiar with the topic. And you have enjoyable anecdotes you tell us. So it was really if we heard you speaking like in your debates, but then in a written form. So that about the book. So now the most standard question: why this book, and why did you write it right now?
I've been interested since I was a teenager in worldviews that differed from my own. I come from a strongly Christian background. I come from a country, Northern Ireland, that has a bad reputation for sectarianism. And I was very fortunate having parents who were Christian but not sectarian, and who encouraged me to read not only about Christianity and to think about it, but other worldviews as well. And that was very unusual. So very early on, I got interested in why people believe what they believe. And when I got to Cambridge, leaving Northern Ireland, I got the beginnings of a lifelong opportunity to befriend, and I would emphasize that, to make friends of people who did not share my worldview, and to ask them questions about what they believed, rather than immediately trying to tell them what I believed. I'm happy to do that if they asked me. But I was interested in what they believed and why. So that's part of the reason. The diametrical opposite to Christianity is atheism. Now, the second strand is that I became interested in mathematics and science early on, although I was and still am very keen on languages. And the big question for me, even in my late teens, was, where does mathematics fit into science? And where does science fit into the big picture? Now, I came across C.S. Lewis very early. C.S. Lewis was not a scientist, but he understood what science was about much better than some of the scientists that I have encountered.
For the people that listen that don't know C.S. Lewis is a famous Christian apologist from, I think, the 19th or 20th century. 20th century.
Beginning 20th, yeah.
Please go on.
Yes, and he came from my country, Northern Ireland, and he was first of all at Oxford, and then he went to Cambridge. And I'm old enough to have heard him lecture, but he influenced me because he became a Christian in middle life. And I've no idea what it's like to be an adult and not a believer. So that was very important for me to read his stuff. And of course, because I eventually got my doctorate in mathematics and went on to be a university teacher and in the end a professor, students were interested because they discovered that I was a Christian and I talked about Christian topics, and they wanted to know, how is that possible? How can you believe in Christianity, which is not rational, when you're a scientist and science is rational? So I wrote my first book, which was called, you mentioned it, God's Undertaker. Now that book has been completely replaced. It was my first effort, and I don't think it was my best effort. I've got a new book that is longer and I think much more effective, called Cosmic Chemistry, Do God and Science Mix? That came out last year. But some people said they found it a little bit too difficult. I don't quite know why, but they said so. Could I not write a simpler book for younger people? And Can Science Explain Everything is a result of that. Not trying to dumb things down, but to present the basic arguments as I see them in a clear way, and to communicate not only that science has not done away with God, but that Christianity itself is a perfectly rational discipline. Putting that another way, the problem is not between Christianity and science. They fit very well together. As far as I can see, the real problem lies between atheism and science. They don't fit together. And so that book came out, and I'm delighted to see it in Dutch. It's in many other languages already because it seems to have hit a nerve with younger people because it's accessible. And C.S. Lewis many years ago once said, "I will be understood." In other words, I want to be understood. And that's one of the things that's constantly in my mind. I want to bring arguments and, as you mentioned, anecdotes that illustrate the arguments that anyone can use, particularly students.
Okay, so also the discussions on the university about the rationality of belief, and if it disagrees with science, were one of your reasons to write it. Do you think there's still such anti-faith climate right now in the university?
Now you're hitting on something very important. You see, you said the rationality of belief. You didn't quite finish the sentence, actually. I would want to say belief in what? The belief in little green men on the moon is irrational. Belief that England may win the World Cup, well, that's a question, isn't it? The point is that faith is operative in every area of life. And here we run up against the first major difficulty that's very common. And that is the influence of Richard Dawkins and others has been so considerable that many people, particularly students, but not only, many of my friends who are professors think that faith or belief is a religious word, and it means believing where there's no evidence. Now, that is absolutely false. In English, faith is an ordinary word, and it comes from the Latin fides, that means trust. So if I say, I believe X, or I trust in X, the logical question to ask, on what basis? Now, science is a faith-based thing. Einstein once said, I cannot imagine a genuine scientist without that faith. He didn't mean faith in God. He meant faith in the fact that science can be done. Putting that in a slightly more philosophical way, that means if you're going to do science, you must believe in the rational intelligibility of nature, or you believe in the mathematical intelligibility of nature. Now, science doesn't prove that for you. You have to believe that before you start. So what I want to say to people is that every one of us is a person of faith. In particular, we have a worldview that we believe. So I tend to try, but I fail, of course, never to use the word faith or belief without adding to it what I'm talking about. Let me illustrate that. People often ask me to give talks on faith and science. And I say, do you want me to talk about God? They said, of course. Well, I said, where's that in the title? And they say, faith. And I say, look, I can give a talk about faith and science without mentioning God, because science involves faith. And the problem, just to finish this point, is this, that in English and many other languages, faith has two levels of meaning. The first one is the Christian faith, the Jewish faith. That is a set of things that people believe and practice. The other is my faith, my subjective trust, my faith in my wife, etc. So those get confused. And one person thinks you're talking about science and faith, that is science and religion, where the other person thinks you're thinking about science as rational and not dealing with faith in the subjective sense at all, which is nonsense. So that's why I deal with that in that little book.
All right. Well, thank you for the clarification. And before we move on to the book, I just wanted to ask you one more thing, because you just mentioned that your math students heard or came to know that you were Christian, and then started asking you questions like, why do you believe in God? And I have to add in God. How does it happen that you're also a scientist? How did these students came to know that you were in fact Christian? How does that happen in math class? I wonder.
Well, that's a good perceptive question, actually. When I was at Cambridge as a student, I hit the ground running. I got involved in the Christian group there, which is now called UCCF, University and Colleges Christian Fellowship. And I ran Bible studies for lots of people. And I spoke in local churches. And as a student, people got to know that I was very interested in these questions. And I formed a large group of people who met on a Sunday night for 3 hours to discuss these big questions, and sometimes on a Wednesday as well. So I was quite well known for speaking in church groups, etc., etc. And when I moved from England to Wales, to the University of Wales, the Christian Union there, the group of students, knew about me, and so they invited me to give a talk at one of their special Christian meetings. And of course, the adverts were all over the university, and people who came to my mathematics lecture said, "Is that you? Are you doing that talk? What's it about?" Well, I would say, "Come and you'll see." And in that way, the word spread. And so communication was easy. I think what's behind your question is that, of course, I couldn't talk about God and Christianity in mathematics lectures. Right. Only atheists can do that and get away with it. They can talk about their atheism. But if you start talking about Christianity, I was paid to teach maths, and I taught maths. But attitude to students counts for everything, and they see you're friendly and all that kind of thing. And they get to know. And of course, when I began to publish books and do debates, of course, everybody knew. Far too many people knew.
Interesting. Yeah. So, Michiel, I think it's time to dive in the arguments right now.
Yes, yeah. So the book is full of arguments, and we can't, of course, treat all of them. So we picked a few that we thought were interesting.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, or we had some questions about them. Would you like to start?
Maybe it's good if you start with the second one.
Yes. Okay. Sure. That's
save time.
Yes. You mentioned before Einstein, and this is something we noted in your book. Sometimes you either mention Einstein who says something or a Nobel Prize winner. I have one quote here of Alan Sandage, who won a similar prize or an equivalent of Nobel Prize. And you quote him where he says, "Well, God to me is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence." And you quote more scientists, also non-Christian or atheist scientists. But we were wondering, well, do you think, well, why do you use that kind of argument, or a kind of do you point to these authoritative figures to maybe support your argument a bit?
Well, I do that because the world was, it's less now, but the world was, and students are interested in what these people think. And that is what forms their opinion. Many, many young people's opinion has been formed by Richard Dawkins saying God is a delusion. And the common feeling among many people is that no scientist who's sensible believes in God. And so it is very important to establish credential and also point out that actually there are more living and working and eminent scientists who believe in God than many people think. And that's an important, I don't rely only on such arguments. And that may be behind your question.
So what like a counterbalance to the arguments that most students have heard already from Richard Dawkins. And then you say, well, there are also other scientists who say otherwise.
Yes, and then you analyze the argument. You don't let it rest there. So when Stephen Hawking, I think I mentioned him in the book, Stephen Hawking makes an assertion that he solved the problem why there's something rather than nothing and he doesn't need God. He is using his authority in a field that's not his own. Now, I do the same thing. We all do it. Otherwise, life would be totally boring. But what you need to do, and what I try to do very carefully when I go outside fields that are not my own direct research field, I try to consult the experts. And so when, for example, I see Richard Dawkins, just for example, saying a good case can be made out for the fact that Jesus never existed, although he qualifies and says, although I myself don't go down that route, I check up on who he's quoting, and he's quoting a retired professor of German literature, not an ancient historian. And that bothers me. Why not check with the experts in the field? And expertise is important. If you think of Paul in the New Testament, when he was arrested in Jerusalem on the steps of the Antonia fortress, and there was likely to be a riot, he quietened the crowd by saying, look, I did my PhD, I'm putting it into modern English, I did my PhD under Gamaliel, one of the most famous teachers of the day. And I think the important thing is, from the Christian perspective, and this is extremely important, the danger with highly educated Christians or anybody else is that they trust their minds and they use God when they get stuck. But what Paul did was to use his mind and trust God. And the challenge for any of us in communicating Christianity is, what am I trusting? Am I trusting my mind and my own cleverness, or am I trusting God and using my gifts to communicate? And I think that helps. But I think it's just one part of arguing, and you get it happening in the New Testament. It was a very big problem for Paul that so few of his fellow Jews believed.
Right.
Why aren't there more if this is true? This is a perennial problem. So it's helpful to correct imbalance when people think statistically that, oh, the vast majority of scientists don't believe in God. That just isn't true. But you want to give some evidence in the other direction.
So
Do you think there's a problem? Do you think there's a problem with that kind of argumentation?
No, I don't think so. We just noticed it. But if I understand you correctly, if there would be a majority of scientists who wouldn't believe in God or who are atheists, you might still have your arguments, which are in this book and have many of them.
Yes,
But it's more
you're
about
right.
showing what's really, like, who really knows about this, and what do they say, the people that know about it, what do they say about the evidence?
Yes, that's why I was very careful to say that that's only one kind of argument. And it's an argument used against a claim that very few scientists believe in God. It's a factual argument. But of course, my main concern is whether Christianity is true or not. And you don't settle that by statistics.
Right. Okay, so let's move to a more truth-apt argument then.
Yeah, we were really impressed about the arguments that was about the reliability of our rationality, of our cognitive faculties. And I would like to quote you from your book. And here is a quote. For if thought is replaced by electrochemical neural events, two such events cannot confront each other in rational discourse. They are neither right or wrong. They simply happen. The world of rational discourse disappears into the absurd chatter of firing synapses. Quite frankly, that can be right, and none of us believe it to be so. And then it continues with, modern humanism is the faith that through science, humankind can know the truth. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. So, if I would summarize the saying here, I would say that you say our thoughts are just electrochemical events, and that does mean that thoughts are nothing else but firing neurons. So, you say that we need to have a soul in order to speak of human rationality, a rationality that is aimed at truth. Am I right here?
Well, I don't think I said we need to have a soul. I don't think I used the word soul. Those two quotations are interesting because the first of them comes from someone who taught me quantum physics years ago, who is a Christian, or was a Christian, Professor Sir John Polkinghorne.
That's right.
The second quote is from an atheist. And that's why it's extremely important, because he sees the problem, which very few people have seen, with the naturalistic explanation of the human mind. What often happens, and it's caused me a lot of amusement in a way. When I meet scientists, often I'll say to them, what do you do science with? If we get opportunity for a casual conversation, and they say, well, I've got this wonderful machine that cost $1 million. And I say, no. Oh, they say, you mean my, and they're about to use the word mind when they realize that it's not politically correct to say mind, as distinct from brain. And they say, my brain. Well, I say, okay, I do think the mind and the brain are very different. The mind story and the brain story are not the same. But let's go with your explanation. It is the brain. Now, give me a brief history of the brain. And they say to me, well, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I say, and you trust it? And then I ask this question. I can't remember whether I put this in the book or not, but it's most interesting. I say, if you knew that the computer you use every day was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And I have 100% received the answer, no, I would not. And I say, I see you have a problem. Now, this observation is an old observation. C.S. Lewis saw this a long time ago. As I think I mentioned in the book, Alvin Plantinga, one of the most distinguished philosophy professors in the United States, sees it and writes about it. But the person that interested me most, who uses the argument but doesn't know what to do with it, is Thomas Nagel. And he is one that you see is quoted there. He sees that if you go along the evolutionary naturalism line, then you've got no reason to trust your mind. Whereas Christianity gives you a basis for trusting your mind. Now, that I want to put into the wider context of the rise of modern science in the 16th, 17th centuries. Most of the principal actors, so to speak, were believers in God. And C.S. Lewis said men became scientific because they expected law of nature, and they expected law of nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Now, there's a very interesting example of where a prior worldview faith commitment, they believed in a lawgiver, actually led them to do science, because it gave them a rational basis for thinking that science could be done, that the universe was rationally intelligible, whereas what atheism, taken to its logical conclusion, is doing is removing not only the rational basis for faith in God, but the rational basis for anything. It destroys all argument, which is the point that Professor Polkinghorne was making.
Is this also the example that you're mentioning about George Lemaitre? About the I think Belgian Catholic who coined or said the universe had to start at one point, and somebody else said, well, let's go with the Big Bang.
Oh, well, Georges Lemaitre was a Belgian priest and a brilliant physicist, and he saw that Einstein's equations led to the concept of a singularity at the beginning of space-time. And Fred Hoyle didn't like that. Now, Fred Hoyle was around in my time at Cambridge. In fact, he was one of the examiners for my final degree. And I met him sometime before he died and chatted to him about some of these things. And Fred Hoyle believed in a steady state universe, along with Herman Bondi and a number of others at the time. And their idea was the universe is continually creating new elementary particles, whatever, one every cubic meter of space every million years or something like this. And he did not like this idea of a singularity. And that's when he said, you and your Big Bang, it was a negative comment. And of course, many other people have commented on that idea of the singularity because it was too much like Genesis. And I remember when the first evidence for a beginning to space-time, the really strong evidence, like the microwave background, the recession of the galaxies, the redshift, all this kind of stuff, came in the 60s. It was resisted very strongly by the top scientist in the world's most famous scientific journal, Nature, a man called Maddox. And he said, we mustn't go down this route. Why? Because it will give too much leverage to people that believe in Genesis. In the beginning, God created. And that's absolutely fascinating, because so far as the current state of science is concerned, science changes and one must be realistic. As far as the current state is concerned, there is a deep concord there with the idea of a beginning and the scientific notions of it.
If you go back to the argument, then you say, well, it's not sound. You can't explain rationality from an evolutionary perspective. But don't you implicitly then assume a soul that explains it?
Well, just a moment. It's the atheist colleagues, the philosophers, who are saying that the evolutionary thing doesn't explain rationality. The concept of a soul is very difficult, actually, as you may know, because even in the biblical use, the word psyche, which is translated soul, which is often, well, comes in our word psychology and means life. You have to ask yourself, as to the context, exactly what it means, because sometimes it stands for a person's whole life. Sometimes Paul will say, or John will say, I hope you are well, even as your soul is well. And it is one of these strange words that varies in its meaning in the New Testament, and you have to determine it by its context and see what it means. That's the first problem. For example, the Apostle Peter talks about the salvation of the soul. And what he means there, as I understand it, is relationship with Christ transforms your life and fills it with meaning. Mm-hmm. Now, what you may be hinting at, and I'm happy to talk about it, is whether I think, whether I'm a monist or not, or a dualist. And I'm unashamedly believe that there are two things, however you're going to describe them. Let me tell you a little story. You probably like stories. I was at a conference once where dual aspect monism was being talked about. It was the old story of the relationship of the body to the mind and all this kind of thing. And what was being favored was there was one kind of stuff, to put it crudely, but two aspects to it. One was body and the other was mind or soul or whatever.
Yeah.
And in the end, I just asked a question. I made a statement, actually. It took 3 words. God is spirit. And there was complete consternation. The person giving the speech was so angry. She said, my philosophy cannot deal with that. And she got up and walked out.
Really?
It was a big international conference. And the thing here that is important for me, it doesn't answer your question, but it gives you a focus. We have been brainwashed, and I think it is brainwashed, into thinking that everything is bottom up, beginning with mass energy, or these days just nothing. Nothing produces everything by some magic. And all else is derivative, including mind and the idea of God. That is the secular story. But the Christian story is the exact opposite of that, and that is quite striking. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him. It's an existence statement. It's how things came to be. And the ancients were fascinated by that question of existence. How did they come to be? So according to the biblical worldview, God, the mind of God, is primary, and it's in that very book that says that, John's Gospel, that says God is spirit. The primary stuff in the universe, therefore, is not matter, it's spirit. whatever that is. And here you will ask me, of course, to define it. But many of these things are impossible to define. Nobody can even define matter, let alone spirit. It's a very odd thing that we use words. And like Augustine says, when it comes to the word time, everybody knows what it means until you ask them to define it. Big concepts are like that.
Yeah.
But we use them because they're useful.
Right. So you already introduced the term of dualism, the belief that there is more than matter, that there is also how you would define it, but also a kind of spirit.
But that's a good point.
Yeah.
There is more than. And I'll just
matter.
stop you there for a moment, because that seems to me to be one of the most important shifts in culture today. Many people are reacting against the kind of shrill atheism of Dawkins and co. They look at the universe, and they're not Christian, they're not theists yet, but they're saying there must be more than this. There's more than matter. In other words, they're finding materialism is very unsatisfactory.
And if you zoom a bit in materialism, because they say they adhere a kind of emergentism as a theory.
Yes.
You seem to be familiar with it, and it says, well, if
I would hope so.
if you have small substances who become more complex, they get more kind of characteristics. So if a water molecule comes to parts, then it gets a polarity, it gets a surface tension that are characteristics. So it's also with life. If a cell works, then it has the characteristic of being alive. But all the substances of a cell don't have the capacity of being alive. So people who adhere the theory of emergentism will also say, well, if the brain is evolved from small molecules, maybe it also got the ability of the characteristic of having awareness, of having rationality. So it emerges through the process. How would you respond on that theory?
Well, it's a beautiful fairy story. I mean, this is the story that we're told. I would respond as a scientist and say, what is the evidence? And you're making quite a few assertions there, as you know. And one of the reasons I wrote my new book, Cosmic Chemistry, Do God and Science Mix, was to try to bring to the general public, but also to many Christians who are not aware of the development in biology, the so-called third wave of biology, which you might have just come across as a medical student. But the whole Darwinist paradigm is under very heavy fire at the moment. People still want a materialist solution, but the idea that you get things by numerous small accretions and all this kind of stuff is, well, I have a colleague in Oxford who says publicly, and he's brilliant, he's a fellow of our Royal Society, and he's one of the pioneers of what's called systems biology. He invented the subject. And he said Darwinism doesn't need to be modified, it needs to be replaced. So I'm interested because I'm not a biologist, I'm a mathematician, but I read a lot of this kind of stuff because I want to keep on top of the way people are thinking. And if they're moving away from that kind of naive, simplistic, gradual accretions that Dawkins parroted for many years, well, I want to move with them. And you talk about the cell. This is a vast problem at the moment. And it's a chicken and egg problem, because it does seem now that the cell is necessary to do most things. So how do you get a cell? You don't get it by any natural processes that we can replicate. So the evidence just isn't there. Now, of course, if you're a committed materialist, you will try, and you should, of course, to produce a materialistic solution. But, you know, it's a long time since 1953 and 1954, where Miller and Urey thought they'd solved the problem of life by creating some amino acids by sparking a test tube. The problem is much greater now. And I would simply say the central problem is the origin of information. that what you do not get by random processes is the kind of semantic information that is written into DNA to such an extent that we call it a code. And we use all kinds of computer language for it, codes for the proteins and all the rest of it. You know, I do this experiment often on people, and I say, when you see the word exit, E-X-I-T, above a door, at any rate in this country, in England, you know that whatever natural processes have gone into constructing that sign, a mind is behind it because it has meaning. And that's the problem of the origin of information. And the matter of consciousness, how things got awareness, nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest clue. Nobody knows what consciousness is. And that, of course, is one of the great blockages in the way of artificial intelligence, about which you may know I've just written a book called 2084 that came out a year or so ago. That's the big problem. No one knows what it is, to such an extent that many of the experts say, look, all we need to do is simulate intelligence. We're not creating consciousness. We haven't a clue what it is. And therefore, there's no point in simply guessing. Perhaps material, when it gets very complex, becomes aware. That's just, as I said, a fairy story until you've got hard evidence, which we haven't got.
All right. This is very interesting, and I would love to go on about
I'm sure
this,
you
but
will.
maybe I don't know if our listeners are
bored.
are bored or are still with us. So
Or hungry for new arguments, Michiel,
yeah.
to hear.
Maybe we should treat one or two more arguments if that's fine.
Yes,
with you,
that's fine. That's fine.
And then we want to ask you some final questions before we close off.
Okay.
So I think that this might tie in quite nice with it. You mentioned the how going from matter to mind is like a fairy tale.
Well, the atheistic version of it. You see, if I might break in there, the biblical record is very simple. It uses very few words and a lot may lie behind it. But if you take the Genesis record and ask yourself, how was it done? You have a frequently repeated phrase, and God said. And God said, let there be light. And God said. It doesn't come very often. And I'm very cautious. I said, it's fascinating to me that there are two of those Genesis days, and we could discuss what they are. I've written a whole book about them, so I'm not going to go into that now. Two of those days in which God speaks more than once. And the very interesting thing is that's day 3 and day 6. And it's making the difference between inorganic material and organic. That is non-life and life. Right. And God said, and I word myself very carefully, according to the Bible, you do not get life from non-life without and God said, which gives me the impression that you've got an open system, not a closed system, as the materialist is forced to believe in, an open system, but information and energy is being fed into it from outside. So this is not emergence. Right. I noticed you liked the word emergence that had. You see, emergence covers a multitude of sins. When people say to me, it emerges, I say, well, now just a minute. Does it emerge naturally without any involvement of anything else? Or does it need a catalyst? Or does it need heat? Or does it need information? Because you get all sorts of emergence. It's a non-word. It's like people saying, well, evolution did it when you've no mechanism.
If I may stop you there,
I
follow the argument. But what I was trying to get at is, you're saying, well, such an account of emergence might be an atheist fairy tale, but the atheist will probably say, well, the Bible is a book of fairy tales, and
well,
you're just positing God to account for going from nothing
to something.
Indeed. So why is God an explanation stopper and emergence not?
I prefer an explanation that makes sense to one that doesn't make sense. And the explanation that drove the rise of modern science is a rational explanation that people have been thinking about for thousands of years. That's point number one. But point number two is, what is the nature of what has to be explained? Two very big things. One is the mathematical intelligibility of the universe, and two is the semantic nature of organic molecules like DNA. Now, you have to explain language. There is only one explanation we know of for language, and that is mind. So it seems perfectly rational to postulate a mind as an explanation. It's not a proof, of course. You only get proof in my field, pure mathematics. But it gives evidence and it makes sense. It's a coherent explanation. Now, you'll probably know in philosophy there are two criteria for truth. One is it makes sense, it's coherent, and the other is it cogs into our experience of the world. Now, if you want to say, no, all this talk about God is a fairy tale, well, I was challenged about that in Utrecht. And Delft. I was speaking at the Technical University in Utrecht. And a physicist there said, your belief in God is like Father Christmas. Do you know what happened?
Everybody laughed?
No.
Oh.
They didn't laugh at that point. I said, my belief in God is like Father Christmas. I said, we can deal with that. And I asked the audience, there were over 1,000 people there. It was filmed for EO. And I said to the audience, I want to ask you, how many of you came to believe in Father Christmas as an adult? Dead silence. And then I said, how many of you came to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God risen from the dead as an adult? Hundreds of hands went up. And I said quietly to the physicist, listen, people, the finest brains in the world have not, as you ought to know, been studying Father Christmas for centuries because claims about him made sense, but they have been studying God. And I'm afraid you're risking insulting our intelligence, quite frankly. And he was. It's a tragedy to me.
So although you probably were very relaxed and calm at that moment, you had a very sharp rebuttal of that.
Absolutely. The point is sometimes it's important to just show things what they're like. But behind your question is a very important question. And that is the accusation I often get, you believe in a God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. No. Taking a nuanced view of this, and I explain this in my new book in great detail, there are good gaps and bad gaps. The bad gaps, in my view, are the ones that science closes. In other words, if I say to you, look, do you want to understand lightning? Well, it's the God of lightning is shooting the lightning bolts down. Well, go to Amsterdam and go to your university and take a first course in atmospheric physics, and that God disappears. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, the big problem is that people like Stephen Hawking, and he says so in his book, he thinks that someone like me and you think of God of the Bible in that way, that he's a placeholder until we get something better. And so I often say to people, have you ever read the beginning of Genesis? In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. And I let them think about that. I said, that's exactly what you think I believe. But you see, the biblical claim is he created the whole lot, the heavens and the earth, the bits we do understand and the bits we don't. And I said, have a look at the bits we do understand. When Isaac Newton proposed his law of gravitation, he didn't say, well, now I understand how it works, I don't need God. No. He wrote the most brilliant book in the history of science, Principia Mathematica, and he expressed in it the hope that it would lead thinking people to believe in a deity. Now, in Amsterdam, you've got a very famous museum called the Rijksmuseum, isn't that right?
That's right.
With some marvelous pictures there, and I think the Night Watchman is there. Is that right? By Rembrandt.
Yes, yeah.
Now, if I know nothing about painting, and you bring me in and stand me in front of that, and I say, well, it's blobs of painting, I can't really see what's that light doing there, and so on. I don't see the genius of Rembrandt because I haven't studied painting, but you have. And you say, but just look at the way the light is falling on those faces and this and this and this. Because you understand it, what it speaks to you of is the genius of the person that did it. It's exactly the same, to my mind, with the universe. The heavens declare the glory of God. That's a perception. It's obvious, even to Dawkins. So he has to invent a system to get rid of that perception as a valid one. You see? So what I say to people is that I do not believe in a God of the gaps, but I believe that if you assume a materialist worldview, you're bound to come to frontiers that you cannot pass using simply materialism, simply because the universe is bigger than that.
Right.
You know, let me put it another way. If you're a physicist and you have a machine that only sees visible light, and my name is Röntgen, and I live in Würzburg, and I come along and say to you, I think I've discovered something very strange, which I call X-rays. And you say, let me have a look, and you use your machine, and you say, but my machine sees nothing. No, because it was designed not to see anything but visible light.
Right.
And that is what is happening. And I think we need to be very careful. And what I plead for is the natural sciences are not coextensive with rationality. Even within themselves, a scientific explanation is rarely total. Think of gravity. What I mean
on that, because
yes.
What do you mean with coextensive?
Yeah, think of the law of gravitation. I used to think, because I was badly taught in early school, that it explained gravity, but it doesn't. Nobody knows what gravity is, even today, and Newton realized that. What the law of gravitation does is brilliant. Enables us to calculate how, say, two heavy bodies would move in relation to each other, so you can work out the motion of the planets around the sun. But it doesn't tell you what gravity is. And often people are not taught, because they're not taught enough philosophy. It may be different in the Netherlands. I hope it is. But they don't realize that a scientific explanation is limited. And the one thing the natural sciences cannot do is deal with questions of meaning. And these days, I meet more and more people, not only students, but professors, and they are very interested in the bigger question of meaning.
I think this is a nice introduction into our next topic, Michiel.
Yeah, but we have to be sure that you're still have some energy left, Professor Lennox.
Very little, but we can go a little.
Which one did you want to discuss?
Maybe the topic about miracles? Or did you
the final argument we would like to discuss then.
I think everybody is interested in miracles because it's mystical and everyone wants to know if it's real or if it's happening. Some people are really against it. We find it difficult to believe in it. Sometimes.
Well, it depends. It depends what you're claiming.
Yeah.
If you're claiming that some statue is weeping or that it's a miracle that Jim passed his exam, the word miracle can be used
That's right.
in many contexts.
Let me introduce it some more. But you describe natural laws, that it says something about nature and not about the supernatural. And you have a specific description in your book that you say the natural laws are descriptions of patterns in our world were valid at instances when God does not interfere. So you add that last sentence, if God does not interfere, into your definition of the natural law for what it means to you. And that's new because We didn't hear that at the universities when we were taught that.
No, I'm sure you weren't, but I didn't use the word interfere. I used the word intervene.
Intervene.
That's a very different thing. Interfering means that somebody's doing something and you get involved and wreck the situation and cause a lot of trouble. Interfering. But intervening, let me explain this, because this is actually a very important question, and it's a good one to end on. The whole question of miracle and the supernatural. And it's raised at Christmas time because the central claim of Christianity is that God became human. That is supernatural, clearly on any understanding of what is natural or not. And most of the objections to the concept of the supernatural or miracle in that sense, and I'm going to confine myself to the kind of miracles that are mentioned in the New Testament, because I said there are all kinds of spurious claims and we have to be very guarded about those. And so it's better to stick to central things like the incarnation of God in Christ, the resurrection, and the things that Jesus did. So let's stick there for a minute. The big objection on the part of scientists and philosophers has been for some hundreds of years, the one coming from David Hume, who said that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. And essentially, to cut a long story short, because I deal with it in considerable detail in the book, they can't happen because we know the laws of nature and they're fixed. And David Hume was wrong. Now, that sounds a very strong statement to make, but the world expert on David Hume was an English philosopher called Anthony Flew, and I got to know him a little towards his latter years. And interestingly, in light of what we've been discussing, he came to believe there was a God behind the universe because of the semantic nature of DNA. And I was able to ask him personally, what about your views on David Hume? And very modestly, I mean, I was amazed at this confession from a philosopher who was the world expert in David Hume. He told me quite simply, I was wrong about David Hume and Hume was wrong.
Wow.
Now, the reason Hume was wrong was seen long ago by C.S. Lewis. It's a total misunderstanding about what we mean by laws of nature. It confuses it with laws of a country, moral laws and laws of England, so to speak. And Lewis's illustration, I think, clears the matter up brilliantly, at least to start with. It helps us understand that if you come to Oxford and you stay in a hotel and you put, let's say, €100 in your hotel drawer on night number 1 and 100 on night number 2 because you're being very well paid. And then you wake up the next morning and you find only €50. What do you conclude? That the laws of arithmetic have been broken or the laws of England? I think you conclude that the laws of England have been broken. And how do you know that? Because you know that the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. Mm-hmm. You see, the interesting thing about a miracle, and remember the word miracle comes from Latin miraculum, something to be wondered at. It doesn't necessarily, that word, involve the supernatural. What we're talking about is supernatural, where something happens that doesn't appear to be within the normal workings of the universe. Now, you made a mistake. You thought that the drawer and your bedroom and the money in it were within a system, a closed system of cause and effect. So they were safe. The money was safe. But you discovered to your horror the next day that it's an open system. So a thief could put their hands in. Now, the thief doesn't break the laws of arithmetic. Yeah. He breaks the laws of England. Now, take that simple analogy and heighten it to the level of the universe. If I drop an apple, it'll fall towards the center of the earth. That doesn't stop you catching it and stopping it falling towards the center of the earth. In other words, you can intervene. The laws of nature are our descriptions of what normally happens, provided the parameters, the boundary conditions, are not altered. Now, the laws of nature, as we understand them, say that a dead person remains dead. And David Hume saw that. He used resurrection as an example, which is very interesting. But the laws of nature, since they describe what normally happens, cannot stop God, who designed the universe, from feeding a new event in. And let me be careful in saying what I mean there. You see, if I said to you, Christ rose from the dead by physical processes, usual physical processes going on in the tomb at that time, well, that would be breaking the laws of nature, but nobody claims that. The New Testament claim is that God raised Jesus by an input of his colossal power. But no law of nature can stop that, any more than the laws of nature could stop the creation of the universe.
Right.
Do you understand that?
Yes.
It's hugely important to clear that up. But the word law is the problem, because people confuse it as if there's a moral law that's being broken or a national law that's being broken, like driving on the right-hand side of the road in this country and the left-hand side in yours, you see.
So intervening is the key word, not interfering, intervening.
Yes, intervening is the key word, and science has nothing to say about it, except that you get at the resurrection of Jesus by another rational discipline, and that's history and experience. Two rational disciplines. And of course, that's a story for another time. But this idea that miracles are impossible, the New Testament miracles, which are central to Christianity, are impossible because of science, is just false, and provably false.
So I think we don't have to talk about the whole book. We have to leave something for our listeners to read on.
Oh, please do.
Yes, I really like this last argument.
Me too.
Thank you so much, Professor Lennox, for answering all our questions and rebutting our objections. I think we will close off. We can imagine, or we hope, that a lot of people will listen to this podcast or watch it on YouTube. And we can imagine them being maybe young people or wrestling with the big questions. So apart from telling them that they should buy your book, do you have a final word of advice for them, maybe, like just in a few sentences?
I have a big website with lots of material on it, johnlennox.org, and they can see many of the debates. And I think those are quite useful, because there I'm dealing with someone who really believes this materialistic stuff. I'm not just producing their arguments, they're producing their arguments. So you can look there, and I wish you well as you search. It is a search for truth. We must keep asking our questions. And the reason I'm talking to you as nearly an 80-year-old Oxford professor who believes these things is because I spent my entire life exposing them to criticism and questioning. So that's all. Dank u wel. Tot ziens.
Thank you very much, Professor Lennox.
Thank you very much.
The book, Kan de wetenschap alles verklaren, is now in Dutch bookstores. We hope to see you, not you, but we hope to meet the listener or the viewer of this video for some other interview. Thank you.